Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well on this Friday. Hopefully many of you got to take advantage and see the Blue Angel fly over, so that was great. That's why my hair's a little bit messed up. But today we are going to be talking about balanced eating, putting together a balanced meal. This is a request that came off of the bridge in terms of new topics for nutrition seminars, and people want to know how to put together a balanced meal. And I don't really like that term, because when we say balanced meals, it really lacks any type of clear message on what to do. I mean, we say, you hear it a lot, well, you should eat a well-balanced diet. What does that mean? Does it mean like a cupcake in each hand, a cookie in each hand? How are we supposed to term balanced nutrition? So it is fraught with a lot of confusion, just from the sheer fact that we don't know how to define a balanced meal. And what you're going to find through today's talk is that balanced approaches to nutrition can be different for every single person and still have good outcomes. So I'm going to try to sort through some of the confusion as far as defining what a balanced diet would look like, as well as defining what healthy eating looks like. And I'm going to tell you some things today that might be surprising to hear from a dietitian when we look at terminology around food. But again, the purpose here is just to kind of help you understand what are some of the better choices for you and your family moving forward to keep you healthy, as well as keeping you happy. And that's ultimately what we want to try to accomplish today. At the end, we'll share some details as far as claiming your wellness credit, and talk about some of those other pieces of information too. And then, as before, for those of you that have tuned in before, we'll send a copy of each of these slides to you as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move out of the way and get to the meat of the presentation, which is really trying to help you figure out, what does it actually mean when I say a food is unhealthy? I mean, it's pretty clear if you were to envision in your mind right now, what are unhealthy foods? Some of these things you might envision, you might actually want right now: pepperoni pizza, French fries, who knows what it might be. Very clear understanding typically when you ask people about examples of unhealthy food, but sometimes a lot more confusion, what I've observed, about trying to understand what healthy actually is. I mean, you go to the supermarket, and we talked about this before in terms of trying to save money at the supermarket. You have 40,000 items in that supermarket that are competing for your attention. And one of the ways in which they try to grab your attention is to tout some of the various health attributes they have. And that's what can make it very confusing. Say, well, this is organic, well, this is natural, this can help boost my immunity, this could be good for my heart, this is non-GMO. So there's a lot of pieces of information at that supermarket clamoring for your attention. And again, it only lends itself to more and more confusion. And to be honest with you, I'm not so sure defining food as healthy is the way to go. I'll give you a good example. So if I were to say, all right, unhealthy food, show it on your screen right now. Yeah, pretty sure. Five Guys, although it looks delicious, I think we could agree that this may not be the most healthful food choice. But let's say I'm hired by Five Guys, say, look, John, you're a dietitian, we want you to kind of help. We need to put a positive spin on this and make it appear to be a healthy food. So I'm using an extreme example here, but we can make the argument that this particular food choice, although we may see it at first glance as being unhealthy, if I were to tell you that it were high in protein, it's a good source of calcium, excellent source of potassium, these are nutrients that we tend to be lacking in our diets overall. You got 2 servings of vegetables there. Our bread that's being used at Five Guys uses non-GMO wheat. Eating this cheeseburger also gives you more than 25% of your recommended dietary allowance for iron, at least for men. So you say, well, maybe it's not such a bad idea. But as you dig a little bit deeper and realize some of the terminologies that are used out there from a marketing perspective really don't mean much. Let's look at the non-GMO aspect of this claim. Bread uses non-GMO wheat. What if I were to tell you that there's actually no such thing as GMO wheat? So if you didn't know that, you might be swayed to say, oh, this might be something that could be beneficial for me. So again, much of the terminology that's thrown out there about food is typically used from a marketing perspective. And again, that's what makes it even more confusing. So that's what I want to help challenge, are some of those misconceptions, and try to simplify nutrition to the best of my ability, because it can be confusing. If I think of another example of a quote unquote unhealthy food choice, something like this could come to mind. Ice cream with sprinkles. Yeah, no one's going to argue that this is not the most healthy food choice, but this is where the perspective matters quite a bit. What if I were to tell you that this particular food choice is actually helping reverse problems with weight loss in long-term care facilities? So this is something that was being done. I found this online at the Alabama Nursing Home Association. They're using visitations by the nursing staff to help provide a little bit of ice cream, some socialization, as well as helping give them extra calories. So again, a clear definition of healthy food is tough to nail down, because we don't eat food in a vacuum. When we look at food overall, it needs to be considered over a pattern of food selections. Calling food individually healthy and unhealthy really isn't helpful, and I try to avoid that as much as possible. People ask me, well, is this granola bar healthy, or is this packaged meal healthy, is this bag of baked chips healthy? It's tough to say an absolute yes or no, because oftentimes we want to attach the word healthy to mean eat in abundance. So what I would encourage you to do moving forward is not look at food as being healthy or unhealthy. Look at food as being either nutritious or not nutritious. And I know that's a matter of semantics, but it can make a big difference, because you can have a pattern of food selections, a healthy diet, and still include a donut, still include a piece of cake, still include some chocolate. What I want you to do is have a healthier relationship with food, so you're not beating yourself up over a few selections that may not be as nutritious as some of the other foods that we do associate with being quote unquote healthy. I don't think the term is very helpful at all, so I try not to use it. It also tends to portray a good and bad philosophy with regards to food, but food needs to be part of a balanced eating approach. So there's room for everything in a overall well-balanced diet. Food in and of itself as one food choice cannot be healthy. People can be healthy. Dietary patterns can be healthful, but to call an individual food healthy or unhealthy, it's where it gets somewhat confusing. So I really try to have people move away from that term, and instead I use a broad definition that looks at healthy eating as, again, a pattern of food selections. And what is this pattern of food selections doing for me? Is it helping me achieve my health and wellness goals? Is it helping me meet all the physical criteria that I talk about with being healthy? And is it making me happy? You know, is it appealing to my mental well-being? So that's what we look at if we want to really define healthy eating. It's the pattern of food selections overall. Yeah, you might have had Five Guys one day, but what's the pattern of food selection showing you? And is it giving you a good combination of nutrients that helps keep you healthy as a person, but also keeps you happy? And that's really the most simplistic way to define healthy eating. It's basically just trying to find the middle. We got food that makes us happy. We got foods that make us healthy. Sometimes they're not always the same, but if we can find that overlap, foods that are going to make us happy and foods that make us healthy, that I think is probably the best way to define healthy eating. Because oftentimes if you're adopting a very rigid eating pattern that's making you miserable, we talked about this with our Fad Diet webinar, that's not going to be sustainable because you're just not happy. So feel good about your food choices. At the end of the day, take a look at, okay, are my food choice patterns helping me meet my health and wellness goals? And if not, what other adjustments can I make moving forward? But do not beat yourself up over a food choice that you might find that's not the most optimal nutrition choice. Just look at the pattern of those food selections. And what I try to do as a dietitian, my job, is to help you find that middle area on that diagram. Where can we find the intersections between foods that make you happy and foods that make you healthy? That's typically where I find the most success when we look at long-term success with getting nutritious foods to be the cornerstone of a quote-unquote balanced diet. So
Again, before we talk about some of the basic guidelines for achieving this elusive balance in our food, it's important just to understand some basic concepts about nutrition. You know, we've heard the term nutrient before, but as defined, you can see what the major functions are of the nutrients in our food. We eat food to give us energy, get us through all of our activities through the day, to help regulate body processes, to help regulate all the different functions of our body, provide structure, provide support to our bones, support to our muscles, fuel our vital organs. They're doing a lot of different things in our bodies, but essentially when we eat food, it's going to typically do one of those three things for us. And as I said before, also make us feel good about ourselves. Now, if we look at the 6 key nutrients up on your screen, so you've got nutrients that give you energy. Energy, calories, well, those are pretty much synonymous. So carbohydrates, protein, fat, those are our energy providing nutrients. So when we eat those nutrients, we're getting calories. Non-energy nutrients, still essential, but aren't giving us any calories, would include vitamins, minerals, and water. And of course, of those 6, if you wanted to rank them, water is by far the most important because we can't live long without water. But each of those 6 nutrients has a very vital role in our overall diet, and it's important that we try to eat foods that give us the best combination of those particular nutrients that, again, make us healthy as people, but also happy as people too. So if we look at data regarding food consumption patterns overall, based on the national surveys that are done, the nutrients of concern, meaning what are some nutrients that larger groups of people don't seem to be getting enough in their diets? It'll be vitamin D, calcium, potassium, and dietary fiber. Now again, this is across an entire population. Doesn't mean you as an individual listening to this you're definitely deficient in each of those 4 nutrients, but those are the ones that we see time and time again where people may not be getting adequate amounts of their diets for whatever the reason might be. Fiber probably shouldn't be a surprise to too many of you because overall as a population, we still aren't eating the amounts of fruits and vegetables that we need to be healthy. That's where we get a lot of our dietary fiber. That's also where we're getting a lot of our dietary potassium too. So again, when we look at what are the nutrients of probable concern across the public health spectrum, those are the 4 that typically come to the top of the mind when we look at what nutrients to consider. Now again, doesn't mean you need to supplement with additional amounts of these nutrients, but it's something that myself as a dietitian, I typically try to look at first just to make sure you're getting adequate amounts in the diet, especially for something like vitamin D. Typically, vitamin D levels are a little bit below reference ranges for a variety of reasons, but when we look at the food sources of vitamin D, there just aren't a whole lot out there. We find vitamin D in fortified milk. We find it in salmon, and we find it in cod liver oil. There's not a whole lot of foods out there that have vitamin D. The number one source, and we talked about this in our immune function class, is going to be the sun. So again, when we look at the major nutrients in our diets, what nutrients that we might need to pay closer attention to, those are the 4 that come to mind. So keep that in mind when we're looking at building that balanced plate or that balanced overall diet. So if we look at the nutrients and then try to take those nutrients into some actionable advice, it's tough because, you don't shop for nutrients when you're at a grocery store, you shop for food. We look at food choices, foods that give us carbohydrates, foods that give us fat, foods that give us protein. It's important to realize that there really is no magic ratio that X% of your calories need to come from protein, need to come from carbohydrates, need to come from fat. There could be ranges based on what your health and wellness goals might be, but each of you watching and listening right now could have a very different ratio of these macronutrients and still be healthy and still be happy. But when we look at food pattern recommendations, it's important to remember that, yeah, protein is important, fat's important, carbohydrates important, but again, just like eat a balanced diet, it's really not helpful to talk about food in carbohydrate, fat, and protein terms because that's not how we buy it. We buy it as a whole food. We eat intact foods, not individual nutrients. Now, if we look back in the history of food guidelines, we're going to do a little history lesson for some of you. So back in the 40s, the USDA came out with, the USDA came out with fundamental guidelines for every American. So again, general recommendations for what to eat. Because what they were finding is that during this time, the number one reason people were not qualified to be drafted for World War II is because they were not getting adequate amounts of nutrition. So that's where you can see in the middle of that diagram, the U.S. needs us strong. Eat the basic 7 every day. Incidentally, around this time, the 1946, the National School Lunch Program was also developed, which again, the underlying current there to develop the school lunch program was to have a resource to help use some of the surplus goods that were being produced by the farmers, but also make sure the children were getting the nutrients they need for growth and development. So moving well past the 40s into the 70s, you had your 4 food groups. Some of you may have learned this in school in the 1970s. You had your milk group, your meat group, your bread and cereal group, and your vegetable and fruit group. So you're advised to eat a certain number of servings from each of these categories. So again, each of these guidelines are really just for an entire population. It's not meant to replace individual eating advice. Fast forward to 1992, and many of you probably remember the food guide pyramid. Some of you might just are now realizing, oh, we don't have that anymore. We don't use it anymore. The food guide pyramid, again, another approach to how to set up our day-to-day intake built on breads and cereals and rice and pasta, and then liberal amounts of fruits and vegetables, just a moderate amount of protein, and then just trying to use fats and oils sparingly. The criticism about the pyramid is that it didn't do a good job at really telling us what a serving was of each of these particular foods. You know, a serving of cereal, is it a punch bowl filled with Fruit Loops? What is your definition of a serving for some of these food choices? So it was further modified to include an internet component where you could just type in mypyramid.gov, type in your age, your weight, your activity level, and it'll give you specific number of servings and ounces for each of those foods that you see listed there. But if you look at it as a teaching tool, not really much sense can be made of this. It basically just looks like the previous pyramid with all the shells broken down. So I don't know what to do with that particular pyramid, somewhat confusing. But again, it was colorful, people liked it. It incorporated activities. That's why you see that gigantic man climbing up those steps to incorporate the notion that yes, the foods that we eat do give us energy. If we are taking in too much energy without enough activity, that's going to be a problem in terms of overall weight. And last but not least, our current guideline, our current recommendation, which is the MyPlate. So the MyPlate is something that we look at and also ask ourselves, what can I do with this particular thing? Fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, dairy. Yeah, that's great. If I can set up my plate in that fashion, fantastic, but I can't really shop for my groceries in that context. So again, part of the confusion with trying to help people achieve a healthier diet is that the messaging that we get is not always 100% clear, and this is a good example. Yes, it'd be fantastic if you set up your plate in that fashion, but we want something a little bit more specific, and it also needs to be targeted to what population you're discussing it with. So for example, in a previous life, I served as a team dietitian for the Jaguars back in the Jack Del Rio days. So I developed a guideline to help the athletes, and it was built on just 3 groups of food. I want to try to keep it as simple as possible. I'm telling the guys, hey, just hit something from each of these key categories every time you put a plate together for breakfast, lunch, dinner, afternoon snack, whatever it might be. Try to get something from the protein group, try to get something from the produce department, and then try to get some type of starch. So again, each of these approaches designed to provide broad advice to a population to help them make informed decisions. And that's why I always use the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate. And this is where we get into the gist of what we're discussing here, how to build a balanced meal. I've shown this several times for anyone that's been through our In Control programs and viewed some of our other webinars. I like this because it does a good job at really giving you specific choices within each of these categories. So when we talk about trying to achieve nutritional balance, paying close attention to what specifically is recommended here, trying to make sure all the grain selections are whole grains, trying to make sure your protein choices are a lower end of saturated fat, trying to choose mostly sugarless beverages for drinking with your meals, including a greater variety of fruits and vegetables, all spectrums of colors, and not counting French fries and potatoes as part of that particular component. And then, of course, most of all, looking to include healthy amounts of fat too. So when we look at how food is presented and how to achieve a balanced diet, this is typically what I like to teach from, because it does a good job of explaining what these food choices might be. If we look a little bit closer within each of these key categories, some of the take-home messages is, when we talk about eating a variety of foods, that's another one of those vague nutrition terms that I hear thrown out there that doesn't mean anything. This is where we actually want the variety to come from, though. The vegetables and the fruits. The more variety, the greater array of nutrients you're going to be getting into the body. Obviously, we're not counting French fries in this. It's not a vegetable. Potato chips are not a vegetable. So when we talk about trying to make sure most of your food choices at a meal or during the day are coming from the fruit and vegetable side of the supermarket. And whenever it's time to include starch with your meal, whether it's rice, whether it's bread, try to make sure that it's from the whole grain side of things. When we talk about whole grains, that's typically what you'll see is the first ingredient word on that label. It'll say whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta. You got to see that word whole in there, and that lets you know this is a whole grain. And then when it comes time to select your protein choices, try to pick the healthier versions of those, the more nutritious versions of those. Again, those that have a lower amount of saturated fat, so your fish, your chicken, as well as vegetarian options like beans and nuts. But don't forget, when we look at it in terms of proportion, this shouldn't be the largest part of your meal if we look at healthy eating guidelines overall, the healthy eating patterns. Probably about 25% of your plate. So that's going to be the best way to stay on track to meet that recommendation. Try to limit the processed meat, so the sausages, the bacons, and then the fattier cuts of red meat. I'm going to give you some more specific examples as we move forward, but again, these are some of the key points of that healthy eating plate to keep in mind, along with trying to make sure that whatever you're choosing to consume as a beverage doesn't have too many empty calories. So water, tea, coffee. The Harvard Healthy Eating Pattern contrasts quite significantly with the USDA MyPlate in the area of dairy. They're suggesting, based on the evidence, that we really only need about 1 to 2 servings a day from the dairy group, meaning that we can get the calcium that dairy provides from vegetables, from fruits, without the need for 3 servings a day. There's different opinions of the interpretations of the science on that fashion. I tend to side with Harvard in terms of the recommendation. I don't think we need 3 servings of dairy a day. But again, are you unhealthy if you get 3 servings versus 2 servings? Absolutely not. It's just one individual choice. The message here is that when you're selecting some of these dairy products, try to find those that are a little bit lower, a little bit more modest contributors in added fat. Regardless of who you are, just try to go easy on the fruit juices and the sugary drinks. We've talked about this time and time again. Those empty calories aren't really giving us much in substantial amounts of nutrition. And then, of course, more importantly, when we look at calories coming in, we want to make sure we're getting something those calories to do, and that's where the regular bouts of physical activity are very, very important. So what does that look like in real terms? So if you look on your screen there, again, we're doing this right around lunchtime. I don't know what you're eating right now. If you're eating and watching this, maybe it's a 16-ounce ribeye steak, maybe it's a 6-ounce grilled chicken breast. But what I'm showing you here is the difference when you're applying the MyPlate template to a meal and how it can significantly impact the amount of calories. So on your left, the ribeye steak, the baked potato, a little bit of squash. That's what we would typically call a prototypical Western diet, meaning very large portion of meat, very large portion of starch, and not much in the way of fruits and vegetables. All right. It doesn't take a dietitian to determine that the one on the left is going to be much higher in calories than the one on the right, which is again using that Harvard healthy eating pattern as a guideline. So half of it's vegetables, the other half split between whole grains and lean protein. If you were to try to determine the exact calorie difference right now, if you want to type it in, go for it in the chat, that's fine. I'll give you a couple of seconds, but sometimes you have to be careful. I've used this slide numerous times, and we're talking about making some trade-offs in terms of the steak plate and the chicken plate. And I showed this, used to do wellness with the Jacksonville Fire Department. And when I showed them this plate and talked about making a transition to the one with the chicken, they wanted to know is that, well, how much more steak could they eat if they gave up the baked potato? So sometimes you gotta be careful. The pictures you show people, they might maybe misinterpret it one way or another. So when we look at the true calorie difference from one point to the next, Alicia, you're guessing 875 for the steak plate and 420 for the chicken plate. That's a good guess. A little bit more significant than that on the steak side, about 1,500 calories versus 475 calories. So again, as a dietitian, I don't expect people to go from that plate of steak with baked potato to the plate of chicken and greens overnight. But if we can make a gradual transition and reduce the amount of added fat, reduce the size of the steak, reduce the size of the potato, we can make some measurable differences that can build momentum towards greater change. Okay, so again, we have to figure out the right combination of food that's going to make you healthy and food that's going to make you happy. So if we look at what actually that would look like in terms of real food terms. Like, this is great, John. You gave me this Harvard plate. That's still not going to help me in Publix. So here's some ideas to consider when you're at the grocery store in terms of the protein, the grains, and the starches. Fruits and vegetables, there's really no wrong way to do that, all right? But for protein, your beans, the legumes, the fish fillets, the tuna, ground beef, tofu, poultry, got cheese there as a protein idea. Just cheese of these ones that are listed here, of all the protein choices, those tend to be the highest in calories, so just be careful of the portion size there, as well as how frequently you might be choosing it when we talk about overall weight management. Shellfish, loin and round cuts of beef, as well as eggs. And then the starches, again, your whole grains, your corn, your peas, we talk about breakfast ideas, your oats, your whole grain cereals, potatoes are fine, barley, couscous. So again, a lot of things to consider there. But when we talk about actually putting it into practice, this is where that idea of setting aside a small amount of time each week to plan the menu can save you a lot of time, save you a lot of money, save you a lot of frustration. I would also suggest that you vary your protein choices to include at least a seafood choice and a plant-based protein choice once a week. At least try it. Again, the more variety we have of our food choices, the more we can grow to appreciate those different types of food choices. You might love chicken and potatoes, but if you're having it every single day of the week, you're not going to love it quite as much. So variety can really help, not just give you some additional nutrition benefits of your overall diet, but also help you appreciate some of your other menu choices that you're making on a regular basis. Just don't go too bold too fast, especially if you're cooking for a large family. Just be strategic with your new choices, figure out what works. Like, oh, my family likes quinoa, but they hate couscous. You know, so we want to incorporate a variety of food choices from the reasons I just mentioned, but don't get too bold with it. And then just from saving time standpoint, try to do your bulk meal prep, whenever possible, just to help save time in the kitchen, because as we know, we are doing more and more of our preparation in the kitchen. So those are some of the finer points. We talk about what does it mean to eat balanced. Again, just to bring myself back in this and start to field some questions here. When we look at trying to determine what is the best approach to healthy eating, well, really, the answer to that. We talked about some of the basic definitions of what nutrition is. I want you to just get away from using the terms healthy around food anymore. Food can be nutritious and it can be not nutritious, but it really can't be healthy. Only people can be healthy, not an individual food. So yes, a glazed donut may not be a nutritious choice, but it can fit into a healthy person's overall dietary pattern. Should it be the breakfast, lunch, and dinner for that individual? No, of course not. But make sure you're finding foods that's making you healthy and happy. And if you have questions about where that intersection might lie, that's what I'm here for. So for this particular talk, just like before, many of you are conditioned to do this. Put balanced meals in the subject line. You're going to get 10 points. But